Well, welcome to the Integral Stage, and welcome, Michel. I'm happy to be able to talk with you today and have...
Thank you, Bruce.
Yes, great, thank you. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to going into this topic of utopia with you. And if you've seen any of the videos so far, we're mostly framing it from the point of view of a concrete utopia, something that's actually practically realizable, and really looking at what is emerging as, lines of real possibility forward for more sustainable and integrative and regenerative ways of living. And so I'm really interested in talking. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to react. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
but actually, that's already a point of comparison with the P2P Foundation, because that was specifically founded on that principle that we didn't want to go into the world should be like this or like that. It was about looking at seed forms, and out of these seed forms to kind of analyze, which underlying logic we could see that could represent the next civilization, if you like. So it was really about looking at things that are actually happening. And if you look in our wiki, it's only project that actually exists. So it had kind of an anti-utopian idea originally, which doesn't mean no progress. It just means that it's not about creating an ideal image of how we should be, but about looking what we can be based on already emerging innovation.
Wonderful. Yeah, I wanted to introduce you as a co-founder of the P2P Foundation. And would you be able to tell us a little bit about what the P2P Foundation is and what you're doing? Just a brief introduction for those who aren't familiar.
So I took a 2-year sabbatical in 2002, 2003, more or less. And the idea was to look at phase transitions in the past. So, the big changes, especially in Europe, because I'm from Belgium and that's what I know a bit better. So looked at the 5th century, 10th century, 15th, etc., and looking at these big shifts in the organization of society. And out of this came a kind of a theorizing of seed forms as key to societal change. And what we do is a constant observation of these seed forms around two characteristics, which is the peer-to-peer principle. So the capacity that we have today with digital networks to create massive open collaborative systems. And maybe we can talk a bit about this later. I talk about peak hierarchy in that context. And the idea of the commons as shared resources, as a particular human institution that works through pooling resources, mutualization, and that historically has been the key in regenerating collapsed civilizations. And so we think the commons is a key human institution, as we move to this kind of global overshoot of the planet and creating a stable, regenerative civilization, that the commons will have to be a big part of this. And then so gradually created interest, and we are a global network of researchers into these thematics. And we have a wiki, which is our knowledge commons, which has about 22,000 articles, I think, by now, and maybe 100 million views accumulating over 10 years. And yeah, so we're one of the voices for the commons in a certain way.
Wonderful. Yeah, I've been watching your work for a number of years, and been talking about some of the potentials of a commons-based movement, even politically in the U.S. and globally. And recently we've seen kind of a retrenchment in a number of places around nationalism.
Yes.
And I think a withdrawal against some of the threat to the sense of local integrity of cultures and things.
Yeah.
What is your view on that tension, and how do you relate it to especially trans-localism and transnationalism?
Right. Yeah, well, so my basic idea is that we went into a wrong kind, as if it were a wrong kind of globalization. that is a direct threat, one, to the planetary resources and the natural balance between humanity and the rest of the web of life, but also quite a threat to local regional identities that have been historically formed. And so these issues are linked together. And so maybe, like, if we give it a positive spin, we could say that part of what is happening now is a regression in service of the ego, if you like. It's because the current form of globalization is so negative for the planet. I think it's quite understandable that people kind of look for something more close, to their life world. And so that's on the one hand, localization, territorialization, if you like, but also some kind of revival of the nation state as a protective mechanism. So I don't think we should be completely negative about that, even though we actually need, planetary governance mechanisms, because a lot of issues cannot be solved neither at the local nor at the national level. But what I think we could bring to the table is the idea that there are two ways of organizing the world, and that they don't exclude each other. They should form some kind of hybrid integration. And so one level is the local, right? And look at bioregional logics about using regional planetary resources in a sustainable way. And that's territorial. That's about connection with the land, connection with the people who live in your neighborhood and territory. And I think in this sense, the nation state is not going to disappear immediately, because it's a historically constituted identity. And of course, it's being challenged, but I don't think it's challenged with everyone. So we have still sizable populations that construct their identity around this national history. But I think so. What we bring to the table is the other thing, which is what I call the translocal or the transnational. So we should not imagine planetary governance only in terms of international, right? Which is nation states making agreements. We should see it also as translocal. And so what that means is that today we have the capacity to coalesce around joint projects that can have different scales, including the global scale. So I've studied, on the one hand, open source communities, which are, born digital. They are global in nature. If you do Linux as an alternative operating system to Microsoft, you're not doing it for any particular local region. You're doing it for the whole world, because digital knowledge can be reproduced at marginal cost everywhere, right? The same cost to make it 1 million or 2 billion is very similar in terms of cost. So that's why it's kind of global in nature. And I also studied the urban commons. So the fact that we have a tenfold increase in urban commons. So these are local people who see market failure and state failure, have new desires like for organic food, and they basically decide to take control of these provisioning systems themselves at the local scale. But what we see is that they're never only local, right? You take permaculture. So permaculture is very local. It's basically in your neighborhood or your village. But the learning about permaculture is really global. So there's a global permaculture design course, and the paradox is actually that people who live together, let's say in permaculture East and permaculture West in the same city, sometimes don't even talk together, but both of them are connected to this global infrastructure where they're learning together, right? So and so we call that cosmolocal. And so in between neoliberal globalization, which is not sustainable in material terms because it overuses the planetary resources, and kind of retrenchment, localized or nation state, ethnic centric retrenchment that can be even xenophobic at times. I think cosmolocal is for us like a third way, because what it says is everything that's light should be global and everything that's heavy should be as local as possible. So we talk about subsidiarity of material production. Subsidiarity comes, it's actually has a Catholic origin, but its meaning is governed at the lowest appropriate level. And so this is what we're looking at. And maybe give you an example, because most people might not be familiar with this. So in Europe, we have a network of 120 multi-factories. And these are, manufacturing hubs for craftspeople. And mostly working with materials, textile, plastics, 3D printing, metal works, stuff like that. And so they're local. They usually look for, empty factories in the ports and the fringes of the cities where it's cheap rent. And then they mutualize. They usually have a cooperative form, use open source principles to work together. But they also have something called the invisible factory. And that's where they collaborate and share their knowledge together, right? So that's everything that's light is global. There's no reason knowledge should be sausage, and not shared, because we have so many problems to solve that we cannot afford not to learn from each other. On the other hand, why destroy the farmers in Patagonia who have the best butter in the world by importing cheap New Zealand butter? That doesn't pay for itself, because a lot of costs are not recognized in our neoliberal system. And so we spend 3 times much transporting stuff than actually making it. So I know this is a bit technical, but I think this is the key. If we want to save civilization, that's a big world, but the idea that mutualization, pooling resources is the best thing we can do to bring down the human footprint on the planet and on the web of life. Just to give you an example, yesterday I saw an article about cargo bikes, which can be mutualized as well, saving 98% of urban transportation costs, in terms of matter energy expenditure. So that's amazing, and we could do systematically. So I have a friend, John Takara, who is a design expert, sustainable design. So he calls it factor 20 reduction. So continuing to maintain highly complex social systems, but at only 5% of the matter energy expenditure. And I think this is really realistic, right? So if we want to avoid like a really harsh collapse with, maybe 1 billion people dying, we can say, no, let's do this in a smart transition. Let's mutualize these provisioning systems, organize them as a commons, using peer-to-peer principle, which means, open contributions, free entry and exit. And so this commons is the core institution for a regenerative period. I look at history that way. And so this is a group of theories. It's called wave pulse theory, where basically you have a civilization that is competing with others. It will overuse its resources. It has always done so in the past. And then in the collapse period, the pulse towards regeneration and healing takes the form of commoning. So let's take the end of the Roman Empire. What happens? We have a global open source community called the Catholic Church and its monks, right? The Cistercians are responsible for 90% of the innovation in technology, agricultural technology, and they develop 75% of the land that will lead to a tripling of the European population. And they live in monasteries, so it's not just the knowledge they're sharing, they're pooling resources. Everybody has like a little apartment, food and shelter, and a rich spiritual life, right? So I'm not saying it should be that way, but it's just one example of how commoning, taking this particular form, is what healed European civilization after the collapse of the Roman Empire. And you can see that in 12th century Japan, in China, I think in the 15th century. And there's an interesting period called the Tokugawa period, I think 16th to 18th century, where Japan lived for 3 centuries within its regional planetary boundaries, with the land controlled by the emperor so that it couldn't be overused. So this is kind of the vision that links, the past of humanity with the potential future, which is a global healing of the land and the resources and the web of life.
That makes me think of a number of things, but one is Alistair McIntyre. Are you familiar with him, with his dependent
Only the
rational
name,
animals?
yes, no, I have not read it.
One of the things he's calling for is a new Benedict. Benedict laid out the monastic rule
Right.
for how people would live in common, and that he feels we're needing new communities of cultivation, both of moral
Yes.
and virtuous cultivation, but also
Right.
of practical, cultivation of resources. And so it sounds like what
Yeah,
you're
I can.
suggesting is
I
in
can
that
see that
spirit. Yeah.
happening because you have the eco villages, which are spreading everywhere. There's now a number of intentional communities. There's a documentary called The New We, which shows about 40 intentional communities that have lasted for decades, like since the 70s or the 60s or even earlier, and have found very good solution to how to organize labor. And recently I was looking at the Bruderhof communities, which have the advantage of being, mixed. So it's married couples with children, multi-generational, which has been existing since the 1920s, and there's 3,000 of them. And they live very well. If you look at their buildings and, they practice regenerative agriculture. So I'm not saying, we have to follow this particular path, but as an example that it can be done, I think this is very interesting. And you add to that localization, you add knowledge sharing. That's very important. And so all the innovations can circulate permanently.
Getting the balance is really crucial. Getting the balance right is really
Yeah.
crucial. I'm thinking of Ladakh and Nepal, places that I'm familiar with, that the more that they have opened to interdependence with global systems, the more they've actually been overwhelmed, and it's been very corrosive to local culture. And
Right.
so how do we, thinking of, I talked in my introduction to this series about Peter Sloterdijk and his notion of global governance and how that collapsed. We couldn't sustain a bubble of that size, and we need to move towards a more foamy topology of these consolidated bubbles together that are unified in some way, but also retaining individual integrity. And that plugging these small communities into the global network often, at least initially, can lead to an overwhelm. And so what are the
Well,
mechanisms to
no, but
get the
I
balance
think
right?
I think of course this also happens because of the power imbalance between, small communities and global capital. And so that's why I'm not absolutely critical of either localization or even strengthening the nation state as a protective mechanism. It's a bit like the Amish, right? The Amish have this kind of form of technological sovereignty. We may not like their decisions, but they have, on the one hand, their religious ideas, and they check the scriptures, but they also look at community. And so the Council of the Elders decides, which do we let in and which do not let in function of the survival of the community. And so I think that nation states have not done this enough. Because of neoliberal globalization has actually made illegal these protective measures. I think they are legitimate, but not because of selfish, nationalistic context, but in the terms of protecting the environment, protecting the people, and using, for example, ecological criteria, which can decide which goods can come in and not. I think that today would be helpful. And I actually also agree with the idea of Sloterdijk, and I've read another book about this. He's a French Spinozist called Frédéric Lordon. His book is called Imperium, and he says anything that's based on affectivity does not last. So we need institutions. Institution is something that can outlast any individual, right? So somebody dies or disappears, somebody else replaces that role in the institution, and the institution can continue to exist. And he says there is a limitation to the capacity of people to aggregate around institutions. And that's a real problem. So what I'm thinking of is not like a world government, right? But kind of coalitions for functional governance. So we can imagine, for example, forest commons, and they coalesce, and make rules, interoperable rules, to protect the forests in the whole world. But they do not own and manage all the forests in the world, right? This is what we learned from open source, that you can make rules, protocols. And so the word I use for this is protocol co-ops. See them as global open design depositories, but not just of software, but actually of rules, right? And the rules can operate, because basically the idea is that we need a global compact between humanity and other living beings that we are codependent with, right? But that's not necessarily a world government, right? But we do actually need, and this is, may sound a bit authoritarian, but I think that part is necessary. We need to protect the planet and its planetary boundaries, right? Like my freedom stops where I start hurting other people, and hurting the very ground of life. That's something that needs to be protected. So one of the projects that we did was called P2P Accounting for Planetary Survival, and we looked at new accounting schemes that were born in these open source communities. And accounting is very important because it's not sexy, but it's how you see the world, right? So the first writing that was found was actually tablets of accounting in Sumer, where the temples, so the early state, were managing the flow of rice in and out of the temples. Then capitalism, that is associated with the invention of double entry book accounting, right? Which is narcissistic accounting. What comes into my entity, what goes out of my entity, and do I keep a surplus? So there's no ecosystemic view at all in double entry book accounting. You don't see the world. You don't see what's called externalities. And so we saw three things. So contributive accounting. So I think the next world, the next planetary civilization, will be based on not commodities, but contributions. It's another value regime. What we find valuable is anything that regenerates and heals and adds value to people and natural communities. So that's a contribution. And so that leads to something called contributory accounting that already exists in hundreds of communities that are applying it. So if you're interested, you could look up a Cocoon Project, for example, as a kind of new entrepreneurial coalition that practices that. The second level is flow accounting. And so this is called resources, events, agents, has no double entry, but for any action you do, you can see in 3D how it fits into your ecosystem. And the third type is thermodynamic accounting. So a direct view of matter and energy flows that you cannot exceed. And so I think this should be like the outer level of freedom is you are totally free as a human being and as a human community to take care of yourself and your community, but within an accounting system, context-based accounting system that lets you see what the limits are. And there's a nice project working on that called Reporting 3.0 r30.org that does global thresholds and allocations. Imagine like a WHO but scientists that keep track of all the resources in the planet, how much is found each year, what is the biocircularity of it, and that then goes into all the context-based regions and cities and bioregions and companies and cooperatives, and so they can adapt their behavior to these physical limitations. And so that's what a commons is. So it means that a resource is not just something that the law of the strongest can deplete, but something that is in the interest of everybody, the whole planet, and so it needs some kind of collective agreement, right? So that's, again, it's not a global government. It's something that is functional for a particular aspect of our common life at a global scale.
How do you relate this to some of your earlier thought on the digital nomads and the role that basically
Well,
technology can play in
yeah,
facilitating this?
yeah. So the difficulty is going to be, to harmonize the geographic and the virtual, right? So people think that a nation is something geographic. You have, Belgium and Nepal, and so that's like a physical entity. What So here I live in Chiang Mai, northern Thailand, and we have, before COVID, at least 25,000 digital nomads. So people are working here remotely, and they go from here to Ubud and in Bali, then they go to Medellin, they go to Tenerife, two different places on the Canary Islands, and they're working on common projects. For example, the Mozilla Foundation had about 30 people here some years ago when I met them. And so we did a study called P2P value, and what we saw is that there's a real attachment to these global projects. So in terms of identity formation, there's also something like contributory identity formation, right? It's not just the place that you live, but it's what you do and contribute to society. So you're no longer saying, I work for the post office. You say, I'm doing Linux, or I'm doing Arduino, or I'm doing, drones or whatever, right? And so you build your identity through your contributions. And these are collective identities that are not geographically based. They're based on what you do with your life in community, right? So maybe the best way to look at them would be in terms of the guilds in the Middle Ages, right? A guild was not just a local thing. You had, for example, the workers who were doing the cathedrals. They were moving, right? They were following the big projects, but they were organized at the European level within that cultural sphere. So I think that in a more distributed society, based more on distributed networks, we'll have to find the right collaboration between the geographic entities that will not disappear, because that's the connection, roots with the land, but also a number of people who are working, trans-locally, transnationally. Either, they're in place, but they work for somewhere else, or they're actually, have a nomadic existence. And I think so the future of planetary governance will be some kind of mix that, I cannot anticipate in detail, but this is very important. It's how we mesh those two levels.
What do you think of the work of Jeremy Rifkin and his vision for the third industrial revolution, and particularly his understanding of the emergence of different civilizational stages depending on the emergence of new forms of communication and new forms of energy production and distribution?
Yeah, I can find myself in that. I know it gets a lot of criticism. Sometimes I share some of it because he doesn't often problematize, his predictions. So it's kind of like a bit deterministic in my view. But I think his body of work is really interesting as well. And he's looked at empathy, looked at technology, and I think that's the case, right? But so the kind of amendment that I would add to it is that ownership and governance matters, right? So you can have this so-called distributed technology, but when it's centrally owned, centrally governed, that is a scenario for a serfdom, like with Facebook and Google and stuff. But if we can find cooperative, collective, with distributed ownership and distributed governance, with what we call polygovernance, which is the form of governance appropriate for commons, then we can see the same technology. Actually, it's not the same technology. It looks only the same superficially, but we can see it as a building block of that next civilization, right? Right now, most of the technology is going in the wrong direction because it's useful for profit making. And I'm also not too big a friend of the Bitcoin model, because my thesis is that any competitive system for scarce resource leads to oligarchy, right? Think about the Monopoly game. You all start at the same basis, but every iteration somebody wins and is already stronger for the next iteration. And so what you have is, we've seen that happen with land, we've seen that happen with capital, we've seen that happen now with knowledge. So that's not a good basis, for creating the next system. We need to find more distribution, but with very appropriate forms of governance and ownership. And so that's why I think the commons is really necessary as an institution. So the work of the P2P Foundation has been basically about institutional design. So today we think value is created in the market. The state taxes the market and redistributes, and civil society is basically like leftover, non-profit, non-governmental, right? We don't see it as generative, but as something you do when you come home after work. In a contributory vision, which it's not utopian because this is already functioning in the open source production communities, what you say is, well, value is produced by anybody who adds value to the network. So that's where the value is created. The value is created by citizens and inhabitants and participants creating common value. In order to make a living, they create livelihood institutions. And this is the generative market. Or it doesn't have to be a market, but it will be some kind of mixed system of all kinds of ways to make a living within that contributory framework. And finally, you need common good institutions. Like if you look at Linux, they have the Linux Foundation. You look at Drupal, they have the Drupal Association. And they're enabling for benefit institutions that empower people to collaborate. And they manage the infrastructure of cooperation. So this is what I see as the kind of next level planetary civilization, right? You have a stack of commons, you have a stack of livelihood organizations, you have a stack of what I call partner state institutions, right? And they collaborate in conjunction with the territorial sphere. And how exactly that is going to happen is very early days. But I think we need to strengthen these commons-based institutions because in a context of overshoot, they maintain a healthy balance with nature, right? Commons, if historically, has preserved an harmony between the human and the non-human.
Do you think something like Michel Serres' Earth Charter is important for achieving that?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, but it has to be complemented by real institutions with some real power, and yeah, it has to be not just an ethical thing, but it has to be concretized, right, in something, and that is already happening at the local scale. A lot of urban commons and open source communities work with social charters. They have them, and that's their constitution. It's not a geographical constitution. It's an agreement for collaboration, and these rules, they are operative for this particular virtual community that is producing something in common. So that's already working, but it's not working at the global scale yet.
Thinking about Rifkin, I'm reminded of some of your earlier writing on technocalypse.
Right.
Do you have anything to share about that?
Yeah, well, that was a project I did in the late 90s. I wasn't the director, but I worked 3 years on this movie, and we traveled 4 months in the US to do this, and I did 40 interviews for that movie. It's a 3-hour documentary about the metaphysics of technology and the end of humanity. So I was looking into transhumanism, but my main inspiration was the idea that humanity needs something transcendent. It's almost like a biological urge. And because we abandoned that in the 16th century, more or less, so technology is actually like a bad religion. That was a thesis, right? So everything we try to do with religion, these pulsions, these deep desires for omniscience, omnipotency, being everywhere at the same time. And there's actually a Hindu scholar that put, the 64 cities, the capacities you gain through yoga, according to yoga theory and maybe practice, were now expressed in technologies for the material body, right? And so the critique was that this is, because it's not conscious, it's dangerous. And this brings me to a book which we discussed briefly before we started recording, which is Beyond Civilization from Keith Chandler. Because, so here's a theory, and it's called religious ground motives, right? So you can't have pure rationality because you always need axioms. And these axioms are not provable, so they're kind of your mythology, right? So you always have a mythological basis. For example, the subject-object duality, can't prove that. It's a priori that Westerners believe that that's how the world works, but you can't really prove that, right? So, but then we're going to build all our rationality around this kind of primal choice. And so this book by Keith Chandler looks at, so he makes a cross between East and West, North and South. So his basic theory is like this: tribal civilizations, but he doesn't call them civilizations, tribal societies share kinship-based structures all over the world and the same vision of nature, of human and nature interaction. This kind of animistic, shamanistic point of view. Once you have an exploitative class society, human life becomes tragic, and you need to explain suffering. And so that's going to give rise to different civilizations which give different explanations. And so in the West, we say there was chaos and this is bad, and the divine brings order in the chaos. And so the role of a Christian, Muslim, Jewish civilization is to put more order in the world. In the East, he says it's just the opposite. The order is illusion, Maya, and we need to go to non-order. So you look away from the world, So the Western will typically say, this is my body, this is my emotion, this is what you learn in therapy. In the East, you don't know, I'm not my body, I'm not my emotions. So these are two polarities. The other one he sees is between China, yin yang, so it's the only one where there's balance between chaos and order. And he uses the Aztecs who reject both. And so his argument is that we now see signs that people want to go back to egalitarian ideas and ideals. And we see that in, the women's rights movement, gay rights, civil rights. So these are all deep human desires to return to an egalitarian society like our kinship society was. And so this is interesting because what is happening through the nomadism, to the internet, is the kind of hybridization of these religious ground motives, right? So I live in Thailand, which is a Buddhist country. But once you integrate capitalism, you're integrating something that was built by Christianity, right? Capitalism is a Christian heresy, if you like. There's a book about it. It's called the Industrial Religion. It's really good. So this is kind of a hopeful idea of a post-civilizational society. So I'm not sure if we can believe that. I'm a bit more skeptical, but I think it's an important idea to look at and to think about it. And so basically that's what the internet is doing as a collective consciousness vehicle, right? It's kind of, so at the same time as people say they want to go back to territory, to localism, at the same time they're also mixing, and that's really interesting. So that's unprecedented. That intensity of mixing and the intensity of desire to go back to more distributed local systems is, I think, something that wasn't there before.
What do you think is needed in terms of, I don't know if you would say a metaphysical grounding or a transcendent kind of orientation that can maybe overcome and integrate, the tensions that are present now? There's such a deep distrust of globalization right now among growing communities, even among spiritual communities, that at one point we're striving and envisioning a one world, and now are retracting and really concerned that there's something diabolical about the move towards the global. And
of course, I wouldn't agree with that. I think there's nothing diabolical about global. It's the particular form it took that is, not the right way. But I think the problem is deeper than that. It's really how we relate to the earth. And especially, of course, Cartesian dualism has been the strongest expression of this split. And so as soon as you educate people, especially in the Western way, but I wouldn't say it's only Western, because humanity has a whole history of overusing. Even the tribal societies exterminated large mammals in North America. But it's just that capitalism has done it at the scope and scale that is much worse than before. But so I think it really is there we should start. I'm a typical example of this, somebody who's, I don't know the names of the flowers, the names of the trees. It's unfortunate, but I live in a very conceptual world, right? And so we have to start at the beginning in forms of education that do not break that connection, with farming, with nature, with I think that's absolutely crucial to start there. What makes me hopeful is what I see actually also occurring partially in the peer-to-peer movement, which is like the maker movement. When you look at maker spaces and fab labs, you already see a kind of young people there that think about what they're going to do, then they do it, and then they think about what they did. So there's some kind of overcoming of the dualism already, right? It's making and learning at the same time. So I think that's an interesting path, is to go in that direction. The typical thing of a capitalist society, Taylorism, Fordism, all these things, was to separate workers who execute from managers, engineers who plan and ideate, right? They plan in their heads, and then they design it, and then somebody else. So this is typical of this split between thinking and doing. But if you go to a makerspace, what you see people is they're all thinking, they're all using machines themselves, and then they're learning from their mistakes, and they talk about it together. So that's different, right? There's in a fab lab or in a makerspace, there's no distinction between a manager, engineer, and a worker. It's the same person, right? So of course, add to that then a kind of fab lab intentional community that doesn't only do machines and digital, but actually also, it's connected to a new form of agriculture, right? High tech, high touch agriculture. I think that's where the future is this this combination. When I saw this documentary about the Bruderhof in Australia, these were people who live a traditional lifestyle. At the same time, they knew everything about regenerative agriculture. Like they were very up to date about the latest, knowledge about how to do good and healthy agriculture. Yeah, so I think that's the direction we go in. I think we are also out of balance between the individuality and the collectivity, right? I do not want to lose my individuality, right? In the individuation process of finding what it is you should be doing on this planet, I think that freedom is crucial. But at the same time, we lost so much, in terms of connection and connectivity and relation to the planet and the earth, that we have to find a new balance between. And so in that context, I see peer-to-peer as relational. No, I see peer-to-peer as relational healing. We were collective, but we had little freedom. Then we were individual and very free, but isolated and atomized. And I see peer-to-peer and commoning as a kind of healing way. We reconnect in these purpose-driven, mission-oriented, object-oriented socialities that bring us together around common ethical goals. Right? It's never, in open source, you don't do something that has no meaning, because it's a system where you can freely and openly join. So that means you have to have an intrinsic motivation, right? So it's not like looking at a job and hoping that the job will be a good one, which is a traditional system, industrial system. No, it's what do I want to do? Is this a good project for me that I can find personal enrichment? I mean, not in the money sense necessarily, but in the sense of personal development, and at the same time serve a common good cause, right? And so that's what I see as also these transitional processes that leave the limitations of capital to go into something that is new and emerging.
You're doing a good job of anticipating where my own thought is going in terms of what I'm wanting to ask you. I was going to ask you, and I think you've taken several steps towards answering that already. But I know that you started out working with Integral Institute, and the peer-to-peer work, in some sense, emerged from that. And I was thinking about the need for the integration of these systems and the proper balance between local and global, individual and collective. And anything else that you would say about your vision of the commons and P2P work that relates to a movement towards integral society?
Yeah, well, I had a long period of learning from Ken Wilber and his work, about maybe 8 years, and I have his collected works in my library. But I broke, was it maybe in the early 90s, because I felt they were becoming too neoconservative. Yeah, so the P2P Foundation originally was an idea of a kind of progressive, integral approach, but not a theory of everything. It was, it's what I think Mackenzie Ward calls it low theory. So it's a theory with a very specific purpose. Let's integrate everything we know around, commoning and peer-to-peer, and it has to be coherent, in harmony with the facts that we know, and it has to be as integrative as we can, but it has a specific focus. So I see the P2P Foundation as a collective, organic intellectual, right? Because I don't think any individual today can have this kind of, huge integrative capacity. I mean, there will be some, like Wilbur and, Aurobindo and these kind of people, but they're very rare. And yeah, so that was kind of the impulse, right, to use and for me, what integral, the most important part of integral is not to be reductionist, right? So the four: cultural, subjective, intersubjective, interobjective, that I find very important, and I still use that as a methodology, as like, did I look at everything? And I don't claim to know whether it's the material creates the immaterial, or the other way. I know they interact constantly with each other, and I try to find out, how you can reinforce certain things by combining, all as many aspects as you can. Yeah, so I think the P2P Foundation effort is part of it, but what I still see not happening, whether it's Game B or all these other integrative efforts, though I think they're moving. For example, I had very good conversations with Jordan Hall and Daniel Schmachtenberg, and I think I actually influenced them a little bit on that, which is, how can you talk about Game B, which is about, infinite games where everybody wins, and not think about the commons? Because the commons is the way to do that. That's how you create abundance, right? If you have 10 gardens with oranges, and something bad happens, and your oranges are destroyed, you die. You have nothing to eat. If you're in common, and you know that your neighbors are going to help you, right, because there's a commonality, then you create some form of abundance, because even if I fail, there will be help and mutual aid, right? So that's abundance, right? If you look at our main page, it says, together we know everything, together we have everything, right? That's the idea. It's just that I'm not for one big centralized collective ownership. I think we need balance. And so I think individual distributed ownership is as important as state and private ownership, in terms of not having one power dominate everything. So that's where distributed networks come in, is to a certain degree diffuse power.
That's really beautifully put. Yeah, thank you. I'm thinking about some of the work on co-intelligence and how it seems to be the case that often when even very smart people get together collectively, we make stupid decisions. And
Right.
what can we do? What are some of the mechanisms that you've seen in peer-to-peer work that helps foster the emergence of collective intelligence and collective wisdom?
Well, so one of the things that we've done, and this is another hat that I created a common strategies group with David Bollier and Silke Helfrich, and it's no longer functioning because they focused on their book for 3 years, and then so it's still there informally, but doesn't really work for the moment. But what we did for 10 years was organizing deep dives. So this was 20 to 30 people from 2 or 3 different groups, and put them together 3 or 4 days, and just have them talk together, but with techniques like the Indian stick. And these kind of deep quality conversations where everybody feels they have the time to express themselves, and they're not in competition. Almost each of these deep dives created things afterwards. Like, for example, the cooperatives didn't know the commons, and commons didn't know co-ops. And in the Anglo-Saxon countries, in France, the people who came to our deep dive started working together, and there's all kinds of initiatives now that it's like there's no longer a split between both. They get it on both sides. So I wish this was possible at higher scale, but I wouldn't know how to do that. So we kept it relatively small and out of the limelight, right? So I still think that is a very important part of transition is to bring people together, especially now there's so much polarization. I think, we're regressing right now. There's a real danger of civil war in the US. And there's an enormous intellectual retrenchment, which I think, will come out of it. But right now we're in the middle of it. And so we absolutely need to preserve these pluralistic conversations.
The snowmass conferences, I'm not sure if you're familiar with those, but they're ecumenical conferences, and they used to gather leaders from around the world to meet together and talk about, their religions and try to find some common ground. And they were public, and they often found themselves performing rather than really meeting each other. So I was just thinking about that in relationship to you talking about keeping it out of the limelight, that we need to foster, I think, conditions for authenticity. And so eventually what they ended up doing was meeting separately, away from the public, away from the limelight, where they could actually really more deeply go into issues and questions and doubts and uncertain edges that I think we all need to face politically and religiously and culturally.
Yeah. I think it's always a question of balance. We do everything transparently. Our wiki is open. It's a commons. But sometimes you need to retreat a bit, and I think that's well put.
Is there anything else that you'd like to share that we haven't really talked about yet on this topic of utopia with an E?
No, I don't think so. I think we covered pretty much, a lot of the bases. And I think the most important message is, so the things that I say, they're based on observing real people doing real things. And of course, I make the hypothesis that this is a new future. This is a gamble, right? Because some projects will not survive, others will, and that, I cannot anticipate which of the seed forms will survive and which won't. But always keeping an eye on it, I think, is important, and see what consolidates. And sometimes you see one form and then it takes off, and it scales virally in the whole world. The thing about permaculture, it's, if you look at it locally, you think, oh, it's just local. But when there are 6,000 of them in the world, that's more than just a little local change, right?
Yeah, I think one of the takeaways that I have here from what you've shared with us is, while it's been important for people to build a consolidating integral paradigm, it's actually really only effective when it's applied in local contexts, in immediate projects, where it can be enacted and tested. And I think Jamie Wheel kind of talked about this too, in terms of how early efforts at applying integral in the boardroom and other things like that actually haven't worked so well. But we really need to continually test them in these local contexts. And I think the work the Peer-to-Peer Foundation is doing is really a great exemplar.
I want to give a little example, and I don't want to be too critical about the example I mentioned, but you have the open source ecology project, and it's open, but it's a vision of one person. And after 10 years, it made progress, but not that much as we would have hoped. And there's a French group called Atelier Paysan, which is like farm hack. Lots of farmers, very pragmatic, and they have thousands of designs. Right? It's so that the fact that they were distributed and more peer-to-peer resulted in a higher level of innovation actually than a kind of one vision. And I try also not to do that mistake.
Right, and I think that is honoring our potential for co-intelligence.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you very much for everything you've shared and for all the work you're doing.
Thank you, Bruce. I enjoyed talking to you, and really great initiative, because we're in retrenchment, so to keep that vision of global cooperation, I think is vital. And so thank you for that.